Starter program. My name is Molly Dubin, and I am curator with the Jewish Museum Milwaukee. And tonight I'm very excited about our Critical Conversation program. In connection with our current exhibit, Luba Lukova, Designing Justice, we have been having some very meaningful discussions with leaders from nonprofit and philanthropic organizations, grassroots organizations throughout our city to really look at some of the fundamental issues that are impacting our city. What are some of the initiatives that are taking place, some of the measurable outcomes, and how we can shine a light on those initiatives. So in continuing this series, tonight we are going to specifically be looking at the Milwaukee Civic Response Team's Economic Recovery Team. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. If you joined us for our first Conversation Starter series, you know that the Civic Response Teams are a multi-pronged organization, collaboration, multi-pronged initiative, I should say. And tonight we really get to look at equitable recovery, how we can look at equitable recovery. And in particular, we are going to be looking at some indices that were put together, some reports. These are well-being indexes that were commissioned by the Hispanic Collaborative of Milwaukee and the African American Leadership Alliance of Milwaukee, and prepared by the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee Center for Economic Development. So before we get into our conversation, I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping and announcements here. So I ask, and our staff asks you for patience with our technical glitches, any technical glitches that may occur this evening. For those of you enjoying the program through Zoom, if you have any challenges during the program, please use the chat feature that's located at the bottom of your screen, and someone from our programs team will attempt to help you. We will have a Q&A session at the end of the panel discussion, so please submit those questions via the chat feature again. And for those of you enjoying the program on Facebook, please submit your questions in the comments section there. And again, our programs team will share them in Zoom. So to get the best possible experience from the program this evening, we recommend that you view the program in speaker view. If you are currently seeing the Brady Bunch style gallery, you can select the speaker view option in the top right-hand corner of your screen. So I know that many of you with us tonight and in our community have made contributions, donations for this program or for continued programs that the Jewish Museum Milwaukee offers to help us to continue to offer those programs to our community. We so appreciate that. And if you haven't had an opportunity to contribute and you are able to in any way, we certainly appreciate that. So one last announcement before I introduce our panelists for the evening. I'd like to thank our program sponsors this evening, and that is the Jewish Community Relations Council of the Milwaukee Jewish Federation. So thank you so much for your partnership. So in getting to our panel, we have with us three very esteemed speakers and leaders in our community. We have with us Nancy Hernandez. Nancy is the president of the Hispanic Collaborative, which is an initiative involving more than 150 organizations and individuals seeking to improve economic opportunities and representation among Latinos in the region. Nancy is also the president and founder of Abrazo, Multicultural Marketing and Communication, a leading integrated marketing firm dedicated to connecting companies, institutions, and organizations with Hispanic, African American, and Asian audiences. Abrazo has grown into the region's premier Hispanic women-owned marketing company. Welcome, Nancy. We also have with us, I hope we have with us, Deneen Powell. Deneen actually came on board recently as the CEO and president of the African American Leadership Alliance of Milwaukee, or ALAM. And that was founded in 2017. It is a cross-sector network of more than 400 African American leaders and allies dedicated to developing, supporting, and positioning Milwaukee's pool of African American talent. Powell offers a wealth of experience in entrepreneurial and strategic leadership, diversity and inclusion, expertise, and skill in nonprofit administration. So welcome, Deneen. And then we have with us Christy Luzar. Christy is the executive director of the Urban Economic Development Association of Wisconsin. She has been with UIDA since 2006 and has over 20 years of experience working in a collaborative, multidisciplinary environment focused on nonprofit, and community development. Christy provides lead support for programs such as Take Roots Milwaukee, Bank on Greater Milwaukee, and also leads in capacity building, technical assistance, supporting UIDA members, and coordinating the effort to launch the Milwaukee Rental Housing Resource Center, an eviction prevention initiative. Thank you so much for being with us this evening. I am, as I said, very excited about this discussion. So to get us started, I'd like to just ask each of our panelists to just share with us briefly a little bit about your organization's mission. So Nancy, do you want to start us out?
Sure, absolutely. Molly, first, thank you to you and the Jewish Museum of Milwaukee for putting this together and inviting us, and in the spirit of Hanukkah, because I believe we are in Hanukkah, Hag Sameach. So, the Hispanic Collaborative, we're a relatively new organization. We are just under 2 years old, and we were really formed, we were born out of community. The Greater Milwaukee Foundation a few years ago commissioned a study in which they looked at about a 25-year period of what statistically has happened with the Latino community in this region. And it was from that study that we brought together community to understand what was happening. There were some really positive things. The Hispanic community is responsible for 100% of the net population growth and the net job growth in the area, but there were a lot of negative trending variables. So the Hispanic Collaborative was born out of a desire to address that, and we have a goal of being a top 10 city for Hispanics on the Hispanic Wellbeing Index, which we'll talk about tonight as our mission.
And hi, I'm Kristi Luzar. I'm with the Urban Economic Development Association, or UIDA. And so we are a membership association of people and groups that was formed to support the folks working in community and economic development. So UIDA was established in 1997. And most recently, a lot of our work occurs in this collaborative space. So our initiatives that Molly had mentioned were Take Root Milwaukee, which is a home ownership and foreclosure prevention network of folks that are very active right now. And then our Bank on Greater Milwaukee, which works on financial education and banking access in our community. We do a lot of work with financial institutions and other community partners across sectors, really thinking about how we can work collaboratively together to address some of these larger issues that take not just one of us, but all of us to really address. And so that's what we do.
That's great. Thank you so much, Christy. I don't believe Deneen has joined us. It could be that something has come up. Hopefully she'll be joining us. But regardless, we'll continue our conversation. And thankfully, we all kind of had some prep together, all of us. So I think we can all kind of, speak to some of the things we thought would be good to focus on. So both Nancy and Christy, you mentioned, and I did in the introduction, the well-being index reports. So I think this is an incredible tool. It has a great amount of information, and it has the ability to assist in so many ways. And I don't know that a great portion of our community is aware of these reports. So Nancy, would you mind kind of telling us what these indexes are and what was the purpose behind commissioning them?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I will share, if you look at the original report, it's about 200 pages long, a lot of numbers and charts and graphs. Great information, but unless you're like me with that side of your brain functioning, you might not really enjoy digging into that. We wanted the next step to really come from community. And we literally got 100 Hispanics in a room with the goal of coming out of it for a one-day session with what those next steps were. But we knew that we had to do some homework ahead of time to translate that 200-page document or report into something that was useful and friendly for folks. So we actually went back to the center, the Center for Economic Development at UWM that did that study initially, and asked them to give us a way to compare how Milwaukee was doing against the 50 largest metros, or the Hispanic portions of the 50 largest metros, and also find out who were the rising stars. If we were going to look at who really had a good playbook, what was happening in cities where Hispanics were really thriving, we needed to be able to identify them. And so thus the Hispanic Wellbeing Index was born. It's a composite index which rolls in 20 different variables. And it's a way then for us to look at a glance of how we compare with other metros. We are committed to re-crunching this index, if you will, every year. We are in our second version of it. And Milwaukee is 44th right now out of 50 cities. We originally were 39th. And although we had forward movement in all of those 20 variables, if you will, it wasn't as fast as everybody else. And so right now we are 44th. And we use this index, which we'll talk about, to guide a little bit today. We'll talk about it not just to guide our work, but we hope will also help guide the community's work. I will share that the African American Wellbeing Index was born out of our desire. We collaborate, we shared what we were doing with other community partners, ALAM being one of them. We asked them to consider doing this report, which we're very glad that they did. And so they mirrored the same process, except specific to the African American community, because we felt it was important to have a data-driven approach and be able to share that insight with the broader community in order to address what our key issues for our community, is a way to guide and coordinate work.
Thank you so much, Nancy, and thank you for bringing in the African American Alliance report as well. And as we said, before we kind of get into some of these specific things in the report, some of the specific data, some of the indicators that were used in both reports, just to back up a little and again say that this is a team, the economic recovery team, grew out of the civic response team, the civic response team. And you really were kind of the latter, team to be gathered among these groups. So Christy, can you address the economic recovery team being assembled and, as part of that greater initiative, and who are some of the partners involved, and what are the connections between them?
Sure. And just for an FYI, I put in the chat links to the two reports that Nancy was referencing. So they are pretty wonky, but they're worth the time. So yes, the Civic Response Team was something that was formed earlier this year as the pandemic really hit home. And so that's a group of community stakeholders and funders working together, and they came around a series of basic needs issues. And so there are 7 or 8, I can't remember if we're the 7th or the 8th ever, but things like housing and food security and mental health and physical health. And economic recovery was one that was formed, the last one in May. And sort of the thinking was this is going to be longer than we expected. The economic impacts are going to probably be more sustained than we imagine. And so they really wanted to form a team to think about how could we support individuals and families and small business owners around the recovery parts of the economic impact. So Nancy and then Jeanette Mitchell, Dr. Mitchell, who was served as one of the founding members of the African American Leadership Alliance in Milwaukee, and I were invited to co-chair that group. And we have the largest working group because economic recovery is pretty broad. We have 4 pillars. And so there's employment and workforce, small business and commercial corridors, homeownership stability, and financial stability of families. And early on, we all agreed that it was really important to look at that economic recovery through the frame of how are our Black and Brown communities doing in this space. The data was clear that there was a disproportionate impact with COVID. And Nancy's group had already done a lot of thinking about what happened after the last recession in terms of the Hispanic community and who had recovered and who had not. And the disparities there were also clear. And so that's the frame for the economic recovery work group. I mean, all of our strategies, I think, benefit all, but we really want to be looking at how it's impacting Hispanic and African American people in our community and what can we do to ensure that the resources are getting to those communities and that they're able to access them. And so the indices, I guess, are really a great place to start. Both groups had done amazing work looking at these disparities and thinking about what does the data tell us and what are the areas that we should focus on. And so when that group first started meeting, everyone was like, well, what's the data? What can we see? And we're like, well, we have a lot of data. It's here. And so I think one of the things that Nancy and Jeanette and I really tried to work on with the Greater Milwaukee Foundation team is sort of using that as a framework for that economic recovery work group. And recognizing that this is work that's going to continue on much longer again than we ever anticipated. Here we are looking into 2021. And so if we really are serious about these disparities, not just in the context of a health pandemic, but in our community as a whole, that is where we should really put that work and rest them within the work that those 2 groups are doing. And think about how all of us in this sector can really advance that and work towards that goal. So.
Thank you so much, Christy. And yes, as you said, these are large reports, but one of the things that you touched on was the importance of having the data right there. So many of these issues, these fundamental human rights, civil rights, social justice issues, these were things we were aware of. These are things we were, aware of in our community. But, as you aptly said, the pandemic really showed the disproportionate way that so many of these issues were impacting Black and Brown households. So before we kind of get into looking at a little bit how that may have, played into the timeline or what the decision of the key strategies to focus on are, Christy, you mentioned some of the indicators. Nancy, could you speak to those just a little bit more in terms of when we were preparing for this, we talked about, the factor of the growing population, being a good place for starting business, being able to get access to loans, to funding to start businesses. So maybe you could get a little bit more in depth in talking about some of these indicators, and then we can really look at, what were some of the specific findings to Milwaukee?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so, there's 2 levels on this. One of these are the variables that we're looking at themselves, right? These indicators. But the other is how do they manifest themselves and what are the tangential pieces to those that we need to address in order to move those up, right? So, for instance, I'll give you an example that is a key issue for both Hispanic and African American communities here, but for different reasons, right? So, if we think about income and poverty, both of our Hispanic and African American communities do not do well amongst our peers, right? In aggregate, and as you separate out employment rates and by ages, that begins to look a little bit differently. But in aggregate, we don't look very well there. We have high levels of poverty, high levels of concentrated poverty in both communities. But when you start looking under the hood, there's slightly different reasons in that. While you have some unemployment and certainly male incarceration rates are very relevant to the African American picture, in the Hispanic community, we actually have high levels of employment, but high degrees of occupational segregation, which we're seeing playing a key role in this pandemic that's happening, not just in Milwaukee, but everywhere. And so that leads to, what do we need to do to address that, right? And for us in the Milwaukee area with Hispanics, we need to, it's not about getting somebody a job, it's about getting somebody a better paying job, a different career trajectory. And so that's all about for us, upskilling and reskilling. And one of the key themes that, this global pandemic has shown a light on that is a liability for our community is digital literacy and its role that it plays in not just that, but across the board in small business, in education, in all of those pieces. And so that's something then that translates to actual work that's being done with the economic recovery team. So my slice of the economic recovery team is working with small businesses and key economic corridors. And we just put out about it's a little bit more, about $70,000 thanks to the Milwaukee Response Fund and augmented by the Greater Milwaukee Foundation to increase technical assistance out there for small businesses, because a big portion of this is what's your ability to pivot without digital connectivity and digital literacy. It's almost zero during this pandemic. So that kind of walks you through how those indicators might and how they're related to other key pieces and how it relates to work. We look at issues of health, definitely. That part of that is insurance rates, birth rates, mortality rates. We look at some of those pieces in there. We also look at segregation, and segregation is a key issue for us, not just in the Black community, which we've seen those statistics very well, but we have some of the highest rates of Hispanic to white segregation in the nation, and we behave unlike most other Hispanic metros, whereas if they go up the economic ladder, you see much more dispersion of the community within the city, and that is not something that we are seeing here in Milwaukee. In actuality, a Hispanic house, there is a much greater chance of a Hispanic household that makes over $100,000 to live in the key urban core in the Hispanic community than a Caucasian household that makes under $30,000, which is a surprising, very surprising statistic to me. So those are some of the key parts to it. I will say that the African American Index rolls in some other pieces related to, mostly related to their leadership portion on this. So they look at some other indicators that relate to C-suite and relate to other information like that, that roll into their index, but ours really focuses on employment, income, health, and the other thing that I'll say that is relative to both indexes is high levels of segregation and the amount of education in the community, which is two things that I think surprise nobody on this call. So.
Thank you, Nancy. So much information there, and as we talked about earlier, much of we are aware of, but has kind of come more into the spotlight, particularly with the pandemic and the amplification in terms of disparities. You talked about where Milwaukee ranked in terms of these reports, which, as you said, looked at kind of the 50 largest urban metro areas across the country, and where that well-being index fell for the Hispanic community was different than it was for the African American community, and very disheartening. But I certainly don't think a surprise to anyone that Milwaukee is really at the bottom of that list in terms of well-being for the African American community. So you said looking at some of the same, indicators, but certainly there's some that are unique to the two different communities. Christy, do you want to jump in and kind of add to some of the things that Nancy has been talking about here?
Yeah, and I'll just sort of add in that, with all of the data that was collected as part of the both of the well-being reports, that gave us a great starting point in the economic recovery. And so one of the things that we've started doing is sort of pulling out some of those data measures to sort of think about how we can track the progress that we're making. And Nancy talked about like the digital equity thing. That's something that's run through all of the work groups in this COVID response team. I mean, everything from education to, small business being able to apply for loans to finding out where testing sites are, right? That digital equity piece is super critical, but it kind of gets you down when you take that data to what's the strategy? Like, what are we doing? And so if you are going to look at, let's say, average median household income, and that the disparity there between Black households and Hispanic households and white households and what that is, it's like, well, what will it take to close that gap? What are we looking at? So like Nancy talked about upskilling, right? So the employment rates are higher, but it's like the sectors that are impacted, right? And where are people working? What kind of, are they earning a livable wage, right? So those are the sorts of strategies that you can start talking about. But if you don't have that disaggregation of data, you don't really know where you're starting. And so some of those things that we pulled out of both of those indices, knowing that, like Nancy talked about, they're on their third ground now of like working through the index, right? So let's keep using those same measures along with them. So is it the employment rate? Are we going to look at the home ownership disparity rate, the poverty rate, educational attainment, small business startups, right? So we're trying to pull out the things that are relevant to economic recovery and then work together to sort of look at that every single year. How has this changed? What's different? And so I think that's the other piece is there's these two great foundational pieces of research that we can continue to use. They don't sit on a shelf. They don't, they could, but that's not our intent. And and then the goal is for those of us that work in community and economic development, what are we doing to support those goals? Like what can we do in our work to help advance that? And so I think that's the thing we're all still sort of figuring out, because that's both a collective question, but it's also an individual question. Like I think about at UWITA. So, Nancy talked about she's on the small business and commercial corridors side of the pillar. I'm doing the home ownership stability pillar because we have a whole area of work there that we can leverage and lean on and a group of people who are already interested in these questions. And so, we've been able to say, well, we already do an annual analysis of home mortgage lending. Let's work in home ownership disparity rates and think about how those two are connected. And then let's go back to that group and talk about what strategies can we work on to close those gaps. So that's how you can see the work flowing from the data down to work also that's occurring already and how you leverage that. You're not necessarily doing something new. It's more like, what are we doing now that we can do better? And if there is something new needed, what's innovative and what kind of gap is it filling? Those are the kinds of questions that the working group has been working on.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Christy. So, one of the things that has been kind of a common thread flowing throughout the discussion thus far is, the collecting of research has been something that's been going on for quite a while now. I mean, this is something that is critical to not only determining well-being, but strategizing and, setting goals. Can you talk a little bit, returning to, a little bit of the beginning here in terms of that you're being, the last group gathered, the economic recovery team as part of this greater umbrella, and specifically in terms of the pandemic, knowing that, as we said, a lot of this research was taking place. Some of, many of these issues were already very much, at the forefront. And one of the things that has come up, really in the first session in talking to, some of the individuals involved with the teams was the incredible collaboration and how that impacted the ability to really expedite. So there's so much that goes into, talking and planning, but with the pandemic, there was an urgency. Can you speak to, what were, how that impacted, the timeline, and what were some of the things that were changed were there changes in terms of your primary focus in, considering the pandemic and all of this? Nancy, we'll go back to Nancy and then come back to Christy, if that's okay?
Yeah, absolutely. I will share that I think this process rolled out amongst the Milwaukee Response Team very similar the way it did in almost every single organization. When you're faced with something of this magnitude, and it really is affecting on multiple fronts, the well-being of our economy, the well-being of our households, the well-being of families, community, etc. You really need to, it's triage. So we're looking first at what is bleeding. Let's make sure we are addressing that to the best of our ability with whatever resources we can. And I think that was the first level of a response from the Milwaukee, the Civic Response Team, looking at issues such as, food needs, health needs, home needs, shelter needs, especially amongst key population, children, an education side of that. So all of those pieces needed to be addressed and shored up the best we could. And, our organization had interaction with them at that point of helping to share the picture of what was happening in Hispanic community and getting resources to get into the hands of primarily immigrant populations that didn't have access to other resources. But we also started talking, one of the things at the Hispanic community, we are conveners. And by doing so, we get to listen and loop together a lot of thought and discussion, right? To be able to bring it back to the big picture. And so early on in May, we created what we called our recovery plan, right? Which was looking at what areas were rearing their ugly head. What did we need to do both in the short term, but could we start as people were starting to get their sea legs about them and getting their heads up and starting to look maybe 3 feet in front of them versus only 3 inches in front of them? How could we, knowing that times of crisis also bring resources, and that omnibus programming will get us the same thing that it's gotten us before, which is an increase in disparity. Could we begin to change that conversation and change the approach and change the dialogue so that we leverage this time frame from a recovery standpoint to come out ahead and maybe close those gaps of disparities within Black and Brown communities? So that's where the Hispanic Collaborative started to focus. We shared that plan far and wide, and certainly with the GMF as part of it. And as folks started being able to get a little breath in their outlook, the economic recovery team was put together, and it definitely made sense from the work that we were doing, ALUM was doing, and Christy being kind of UITA being a key economic juncture for many of these pieces that needed to come together. It made a lot of sense to have kind of this trio come together behind the economic recovery team. Christy, did you?
Nancy, yeah, Christy, would you, like to kind of jump in and respond to that also? And, and in particular, I'm interested in Nancy describing UITA's role as the joiner, and connecting those dots.
Well, yeah, we're a membership network of people and groups that work in community and economic development. So it's the broadest statement you could make, but it does mean that we have a lot of people and organizations and businesses that do work in these four key areas, whether it's homeownership and housing issues, or it's financial stability and banking access, or small business and commercial corridors, and then folks that are doing workforce training programs. And so, you know, our role is really to sort of think about what is the work that we know that is going on, and who should be here helping us, like who has programs and services that fit what Nancy just described, right? Like if we know when these larger sort of like stimulus and federal relief packages come through, like the PPP program, well, let's make sure that our Black and brown communities are tapping into that. And we know that PPP in particular, that did not happen. Micro enterprises and minority owned businesses did not get access to those funds in the way that they should have been able to. So a lot of the conversation, and Nancy touched on this earlier, was, but who works in our network with small businesses and does it very well and works with these communities and are trusted? Technical assistance is really critical, and it sounds boring and kind of lame, but it is the people in the chamber network and the CDFIs that work with these business owners to say, okay, do you have a computer? Are you doing on this your phone? I'll walk you through it. Okay, it's all right. We need to make sure you have this. Like those are the things that get it done at the end of the day. And people will only do that with folks that they trust. And so that has been some of the focus when you think about working collaboratively. Like, you know, each of us has our own networks. Like Nancy talked about the work that they do in the Hispanic community. And so they know who does that work and who does it really well, right? So let's make sure that they're part of this stakeholder group and say, how can you join in and help us do what we're trying to do? Because at the end of the day, everybody wants to just make sure that folks are getting access to the resources and the help that they need, right? And particularly from economic recovery, you know, we're all very mindful and I think scared of like the number of businesses that we think will be closing. That's jobs lost. I mean, there's so many variables. It's really hard from an economic development and like a systems, ecosystems perspective. I think of all the small businesses and the neighborhoods that we work with and how troublesome and worrying it is to just feel like we're not, it's like a stagnant, right? So what are we going to do to make sure that people can make it, right? I mean, at this point, it's like, you know, and this is like where we're maybe 3 feet in front of ourselves instead of 3 inches, but 3 feet, we'd rather be much farther than that, right? But we only can do that, not any of us can do it on our own. And so that collaborative framework is really thinking about all of our strengths and what each of us can bring to this. But from UWITA, it's who's in our network that we know, like, and we've heard talking about this and can make sure that they're here working with us too.
Thank you. So I want to get into talking a little bit more. You both kind of talked about, you know, staunching the bleeding, you know, the difference between, you know, being a couple inches ahead in terms of just kind of trying to, you know, have some stopgap measures just to stop the, you know, the urgency versus, you know, the longer term. I mean, this is a long process. This isn't something that's going, you know, to happen overnight. What, you know, was there a shift in any of the priorities? You know, we've talked about so many of these issues and they're being at the forefront already, but in terms of learning, you know, from this pandemic and learning, you know, from wanting to be better prepared, you know, to be able to be, as you said, you know, 3 feet out, you know, 3 yards out, you know, further and further, you know, can you talk a little bit about, you know, if there was a shift in priority and, you know, what those areas were?
So I can start and then Christy chime in, or we can flip flop, whatever you want. But I will say from the Hispanic Collaborative standpoint, you know, if you look at our 3 strategic priorities, they are still more relevant than ever, right? One is in this area of upskilling, reskilling the workforce. We have a goal of affecting about 15,000 households, an increase of $10,000 or more in their average household income. That's not a small feat for us to do, right? That's very relevant to today and to three miles out. Civic participation, increasing civic participation, not just voting, but where we are at the table, at a variety of tables, and helping to shape the development and policy that has to do with our communities and their thriving. And the other is entrepreneurship. If you think about the role of small business and what it does from an economic development standpoint, it's not just money and jobs, but it's also leadership within our communities. It's reinvestment in our communities and development in our communities. And so that's our 3 areas of strategic priority. And COVID didn't change those, but what it did do is it had us juggle certain aspects of it, move them to the forefront. So while we are still working on upskilling and reskilling programs, right, and solutions for community, because we were so hard hit in 53204 and 53215, because of very high immigration rates in those 2 zip codes, very high levels of occupational segregation. 80% of our Latino workforce there is in 4 industries, all of them very hard hit because of COVID. And so what we did is look at how do we concentrate our efforts in those geographies? How do we focus, instead of looking at a 2-year associates program, how do we focus on training programs that are anywhere between 2 weeks and 6 months, so we can quickly transition? And now the value of changing, upskilling somebody, right? A moving career to something that has a better career income trajectory for them, but maybe is more of a lateral move right now, during this time frame, still becomes very beneficial for the overall stability of the community in there. If I can get somebody out of food service or accommodations or janitorial and into something else that is more resilient, then I build more diversity within the workforce there, and that community becomes more resilient. So those are the types of transition that we've done. We've also put a lens on our activities today, which I am guessing will stay there for at least another year, which is where we need to focus on areas that are either not being addressed in community that are necessary, or areas that are sorely underserved for the amount of need there. Or we need to focus on activities that position us for not just full economic recovery, but how do we leapfrog, right? Where can we double down with the application of resources and collaboration and move it forward? And so, for instance, an example there is looking at this digital literacy piece and looking at really how do we shore up our businesses from a short-term sales standpoint. Well, we have a community research project that we've been running since September, and so we have a very good idea of the economic impact in the households and businesses in our Latino community. And we know that less than 50% of our businesses have a website, and only about 12 to 15% of them have any e-commerce capabilities right now. And so we've put together a platform that is free for any Latino-owned business to go online. If you're a restaurant or a retail kind of maker space, in that maker space, it has full e-commerce capabilities for you. And we've taken out the financial and technical know-how that somebody needs in order, the hurdle in order to do that, with the hopes of teaching them the value of that sales channel and then connecting them with that in the future. And so those are the types of things that we are doing, which also gets us further ahead in how do we take somebody who's maybe doing side gigs, right, side businesses, and during this time frame, right, we're giving them some infrastructure that really helps them move that to a viable business. So hopefully increasing our number of Hispanic-owned businesses in the same breath, as well as shoring them up from a financial standpoint, because we've got the mechanism to apply a lot of wraparound programs and services for them.
Right. And I'll just add in too, I think the shift in the sort of economic recovery space has been from, I think a lot of people initially were, because I think all of us were in the time frame of a shutdown that will be shorter term, and when it ends, we will be able to start working on recovery. Well, that's not what has happened. And so a lot of businesses in particular, and I think there's a very similar dynamic going on in the rental housing market, and for renters, like they needed immediate short-term assistance to get them through the next month to 3 months. They were waiting for unemployment. For small businesses, it was the getting maybe a grant or that PPP loan that allowed them to stay open. Well, this, what Nancy's speaking about, is now it's more about what's the longer term plan? Do you have an e-commerce sales platform to allow you to, or some sort of new line of business that'll allow your business to pivot just enough? And maybe it's not going to be at the end of the day the contract that grows your business, but it allows you to keep your business. And now we're talking about, from an economic relief standpoint, what's another round of resources that will be needed for these folks to be able to pay the rent and stay open and do that thing. So, you know, the federal relief package that's being discussed this week and that people have been advocating for months is so critical. Capital is what businesses need. Income is what families who have lost work and unemployed or reduced hours need. And so that's where we're at. And so we're looking almost at the second round of that, because it's not, again, shorter term, it's medium term. And I said that's probably the shift for a lot of us, has been like we were all thinking shorter term, but we have to think longer term now. And so it feels very patchworky, and it's not great, but it's what we have to do right now, because we want everybody to at least be able to make it through, because then you can maybe be in a better position. And for some of the businesses, it's been interesting. Some of the ones in our UWENA network of the food entrepreneurs we work with, I see some of them really thriving. And don't get me wrong, it's hard, but they are doing things probably, like I know some of them, they've talked about offering their products in a frozen form, but they hadn't really done it. Well, now they're doing it. They figured it out because that's what they needed to do. And so it'll be interesting to see in a couple of years, like for some of these smaller businesses, the ones that have added the e-commerce, and that's actually now a big part of their business, but that's not what they probably thought they were going to be doing when they first started. Or curbside pickup, right? Like I think a lot of us know our restaurants and food services will look different, right? So I think there's a real lot of opportunity for innovation, but at the end of the day, people need resources. And so I think that's the other shift is this isn't short term. And so what are we going to do to make sure that people have a plan that gets them through? And it's sort of the similar mindset in economic development, where it's usually job creation. Job creation is what you want. Well, now we talk about job retention, which is kind of depressing, but at the same time, with all the jobs lost, job retention is actually a very important metric right now in economic development.
Thanks, Christy. That's, yeah, it's so much to take in and think about, and particularly when you think about the long term. And I so appreciate both you and Nancy talking about, you know, not only the issues, but some of these resources that are in place. Some of these, you know, some of these actual steps have been taken, and, you know, as Nancy, you mentioned kind of reskilling or, you know, upskilling, and, you know, to be able to make those pivots, you know, to do those things, some of the things that you cited that are going to, you know, really help not only to sustain, but to grow and improve, you know, the well-being, the situation. So you've touched on this a little bit, but, you know, I kind of want to wrap up, and I know we have some audience questions. You've already talked about a little bit, you know, goals for the immediate and long-term future, but in citing some of these resources, what are some of the measurable outcomes, I guess, you're going to be looking for, you know, when you go to, you know, putting that next report together? Or, you know, is there a marker or a benchmark in time that you're going to, you know, look at what some of those measurable outcomes are, and if there's been a difference? Nancy, do you want to?
Sure. I mean, from the economic recovery team standpoint, we're really looking at, we don't want evictions, right? We don't want the disparities to increase. If the nation or our Caucasian community here is recovering at X rate, as we start looking at who's graduating from college and how have educational plans been derailed, what is the home ownership rate, what is the business closure rate. Our goal doesn't seem very high, but it is very aggressive to ensure that we at least are experiencing no more than anybody else, right? So if it's clear that this crisis is going to cost us, right? It's going to cost everybody. But we want to ensure that our communities are at the same level. And that's really one of the key metrics that we have. So as we start, we can look at that at the short term and we can look at that at the long term. Because, if we look at employment rates, if we look at, right now there's something keeps me up at night is if you look at Hispanic students who graduated from high school, right? There's a school that has close to, 100% college acceptance rate at Carmen High School of Science and Technologies. But they don't always have 100% that go. They hover around 88%. They've seen close to a 30 percentage point drop. These are accepted high school students who are prepared to go to college, who now, because of financial situations at home, can't afford to go. So keeping our eye from a disaggregated standpoint on those kinds of metrics will help guide the work of our ERT. And every percentage point that we can push in the right direction, to me, is a win.
Yeah, I'll just say we have the benefit of doing this work at a time where this is an issue that everyone is actually really concerned about. So the ability to get short, kind of real-time disaggregated data and on key things like employment and savings, like from a national, the trick is to get it down to the local level, but even so, they give us barometers, right, to look at. So I just think of the census data, they're actively doing kind of like real-time sort of checking in and surveying. There's really great reports that are coming out, and those give us at least barometers to look at. But what we're really focused on right now is that disparity in recovery is not the same as what we saw before. And so, like, Nancy described it well. It's like every percent that we can keep like back, right? And so a lot of that is, some of that is very, like she talked about the work that they're doing where they've surveyed, on the ground. That's one way to do it. And then it's like sort of these larger economic indicators. But at the end of the day, it's employment. I think for me, what, she talked about keeps her up at night. For me, it's the sectors that are the most impacted. So like services, accommodations, hotel, like wondering how are we going to, what is that going to look like over the long term? And so that's where, is it about transitioning people to more stable careers, jobs, whatever. But the sectors themselves, like they employ so many people in our Black and brown communities right now that are the hardest hit. And so, from a longer term perspective, it's like, well, what are we going to do to help people to make sure that they can stabilize financially after this?
Thank you, Christy. So my last kind of question coincides with one of our participant questions, and this is something we really kind of talked about, as much as these are looking at, Black and brown households, and we're talking about community resources. We're talking about the fact that this is a community-wide issue. We're all in this. So one of the questions here is, sorry, I just have to scroll down. Along those lines, how do we engage the larger corporate community investing in the smaller business community towards success for all?
I will share, if we think about the confluence of, a health crisis and an economic crisis and then a social justice crisis, You know, if there's a silver lining in the social justice portion of this, it's that having it come right now with this trifecta, I think really allows all communities to relook at what they're doing, what is business as usual, and I guess, put their money where their mouth is on priorities. And so we are starting to see a lot of leadership in that, right? If we think about the MMAC and the region of choice, which I believe is also looking at not just an executive leadership and board of director level, but also a supplier diversity portion on there. I will share with you, and I will repeat this till I'm blue in the face. I am a big advocate. You know, I fully believe that if our communities of color, if we want them to have power, if we want them to help transform their communities, then we need to give them the keys to the kingdom. So I don't want to ask permission for money, for resources to invest in our community. I would like those resources to be housed with community and let community direct those. So I will continue to push for that personally. But I think that those are the types of situations and changes that we have to see as a community, right? And I do think that we have, you know, Northwestern Mutual, $20 million investment into African American businesses from a venture capital standpoint. That's not chump change, right? That is not chump change at all. That is a wonderful investment that I'm hoping, you know, isn't just seen to flourish here in Milwaukee, but everywhere, right? And how do we mimic that? How do we get other leaders to do the same? We just had the Bucks and Titletown Tech and the Packers, I believe, also announced that they were also doing another venture capital fund. And so these are the types of discussions. Those aren't silver bullets. There's a lot of alignment behind them to make the full use of those dollars. That's where I think giving the keys to the minority communities themselves will assist with it, of helping leverage those dollars, but it's a start.
Yeah, I'll just add to, you know, Nancy made a really great point and distinction about that the racial and social justice movement and the work, and how that has really pushed our corporate community to, as she said, kind of put their money where their mouth is. So you see a lot of, so we do a lot of work with financial institutions and banks. You know, they have a CRA obligation, Community Reinvestment Act. So for some of their parts of their bank, they are that's top of mind, but they're actually increasing those investments. So like Chase nationally is doing a huge amount of investment in programs that serve African American and Hispanic owned businesses. They did a big investment in Brew City Match, which is a program that does granting to small businesses. Mentoring programs, you know, over and over again in the entrepreneurship community, we hear that's really what helps sustain businesses as they start and grow. And so the Titletown, that's been a great program for years. So you see a lot of these corporations sort of taking some of the resources they have, not just financially, but also the people, and kind of figuring out how they can support the smaller business community. And to Nancy's point, also making investments in like the chambers themselves, so that serve these communities directly, the African American Chamber of Commerce, the Latino Chamber, there's a Hmong Wisconsin Chamber. And so each of those groups have revolving loan funds. And so you'll see some of these institutions doing it that way too. I will say corporations, and that point about alignment probably puts it best. They probably see for themselves the way to invest those resources are in things that are already moving forward, getting traction, right? So they're going to invest in things that are kind of already been set up, if you will. So these revolving loan programs are already there. So if they had more capital, they could deploy more capital. The matching grant programs, same thing. The mentoring, there's an infrastructure there that they can plug into. But those dollars need to go to organizations that are led by communities of color. So that's going to be the shift, hopefully, that we see for sure.
Thank you so much, Christy. I so appreciate you both being here and, you know, not only kind of walking us through these indexes and reports, but, you know, specifically speaking to us about some of the strategies and particularly the resources that are in place when we look to not just the immediate future, but the long-term future, and making, you know, a measurable impact for greater well-being. So thank you so much for being with us. I'm sorry that Deneen couldn't be with us. I assume something came up, but again, thank you both for kind of being able to speak to the greater conversation, and Nancy to both the Hispanic Wellbeing Report and the African American Leadership Alliance of Milwaukee report. So, and to our audience, thank you for being with us. Again, thank you to our sponsor, the Jewish Community Relationship Council. Thank you to those who have, you know, donated to help us to continue to bring these meaningful programs to you. And if you are, again, able to contribute, we so appreciate what you can do for us. And I think we have the link up there, because these kind of conversations are so important. And, you know, particularly at a time when we're all kind of feeling isolated, to be able to have these meaningful, poignant discussions is really heartwarming, and, you know, makes us understand the things that are taking place, the initiatives that we can look to in terms of greater well-being. So thank you. Just before we wrap up, mention of two quick programs we have coming up. We have our social justice story time, Loving Our Earth, Protecting Our World, and that's on Sunday, December 20th at 3 o'clock. Also, continuing with our social justice series, Jewish Work for Social Justice and Racial Equality, Our Responsibility to Engage. And that's taking place on Thursday, January 7th at 7 p.m. So I encourage you to join us, and also if you want to delve a little bit more into these reports, to look at some of the links and information that has been provided. And we will hope to see you all again soon, hopefully in the near future in person at the museum, but certainly on the screen. Everyone take care and be good to each other. Well-being, it's all about well-being, right? And so thanks again to our panelists, thanks to our audience. Everyone have a great night.